Because I'm such an insufferable football hipster, I'm off to see Dulwich play later today, assuming that the weather doesn't call it off. But why? Why am I going? Why is it that people like me, white, middle-class, fairly educated individuals, like to go to lower league football teams? Does it give us some sort of validity as a football connoisseur? Well, it's all to do with what the Marxist thinker Pierre Bourdieu called distinction. Let me explain. And if you're new here, my name is Ollie. I'm a professor of human geography. I really quite like football. I'm doing a series about football and Marxism, of which this is part 10. And if you want to see the rest, just click on the playlist link below. Now, Pierre Bourdieu, he wrote a book back in 1979 called Distinction, a social critique of the judgment of taste. And what he was doing was he was building on Karl Marx's work about the class distinction, which comes from an economic point of view, insofar as the capitalist class own the means of production. But what Bourdieu was arguing is that distinction is ossified by the cultural consumption of the upper classes, and insofar as that they use all the education that they have and all the various cultural and social capital and hierarchy to define what is good and what is bad when it comes to taste and cultural consumption. To put it bluntly, there's an idea of high culture, things like classical music, theatre, the opera, and then there's low culture, things like reality TV and Mrs. Brown's Boys and all that sort of stuff. Now, that's been muddied over the years, of course, but that distinction is essentially made through a class dynamic. It's the higher class people, the elites, and the middle class to a certain degree. They control what is high culture and what is low culture. Now, when it comes to football, you can see how this translates. So you've got the Premier League itself, you've got the clubs, and indeed the media circus that goes around it. They are controlling how we consume football, and ultimately it's through a middle class sensibility, not least because of the obscene ticket prices, but corporate hospitality and what Roy Keane acerbically called the prawn sandwich brigade, and all the rants against the kinds of tourism that football has, all the various foreign fans that you see in stadiums these days. This is all about who is controlling the cultural consumption and indeed the taste, the cultural taste of football. And of course you can relate that to the football style itself. You've got the beautiful, smooth, silky Rolls-Royce style football of Pep Guardiola and his ilk, and you can contrast that with what's disparagingly called the anti-football tactic of long ball football with Tony Pulis and Sean Dyche and all those kinds of people. But ultimately it doesn't matter which one you use as long as you win. I mean, look at Arsenal at the moment. They're using a lot of these set pieces, but it's the cultural conditions, the media consumption around it, which extricates them and say one is beautiful and one is worthy of consumption and one is kind of derided and one is not worthy of consumption and considered kind of working class. Now, what Bourdieu would argue is that distinction is never natural or indeed neutral. It's always part of maintaining those class divisions, because the people that are in charge, the capitalist class, who want to maintain that distinction, they will be in charge of making sure that cultural consumption around it, to say, yes, this is the kind of football that you want to aspire to. This is the kind of culture which you need to consume. And so you working class people who like this other kind of football or like these other kinds of popular cultures, this is something to aspire to. So you stay and work. You stay subservient, you stay locked into the chains of labour production so we can consume this. But it gives them something to aspire to, so it just maintains that distinction. Now, what's that got to do with hipsters and football, I hear you cry? Well, ultimately, these days, in the 2020s, hipsters stand in for that kind of cultural consumption, particularly in areas like football. Ultimately, it's people in the city, the rich financial folk, who are cosplaying as working class people to go and spend their time at the Tottenham Stadium, going to the pubs at the weekend, and then going back to the city on the Monday to earn the money which actually allows them to afford those season tickets in the first place. And so what football hipsters are doing is that they are using their cultural capital to say, oh no, we really like these obscure teams because we are the ones with the money and the capital and the knowledge to be able to actually enjoy it properly. So that's Bourdieu's notion of the Marxist version of distinction in a nutshell. But before you start deriding me as one of those hipsters which is enforcing that division, which is actually being part of that class distinction and creating that cultural consumption and keeping people in servitude, I am going to Dulwich Hamlet today, not for the home team, but for the away team, Dover. Come on, the Whites!